Good morning. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday morning. Special time. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Guy in Ohio, Paul in the Great Northwest, Joe in the Inland Empire, Karen in Northern California, Nancy in North Carolina, Bella in Florida, Joseph. I was just catching up on yesterday as I got the notification. Doubled off for me. I almost called this morning a doubled off, so it would have been a triple for you. Ella's in the house. Welcome, everybody. We are opening a new chapter, the final chapter of Tractate Bava Metzia, chapter 10. Our daf is, I guess it's technically page 116, right? It's page 116. But we're starting on 116b. We got a good head start on it yesterday. Tomorrow we'll do 117, but we'll get a good jump on that. And then tomorrow's Wednesday, so Thursday we'll make a siyum with God's help on Tractate Bava Metzia, because the final page, 119, is very short. So plan on the siyum, bring something to make a l'chaim as we celebrate, God willing, finishing Tractate Bava Metzia. And so on Friday, we should be opening the last of these the middle gate, this wonderful three tractate section, the Bavas, right? We had Bava Kama, now we're finishing Bava Metzia, and on Friday we'll open Bava Basra, which I think is the longest tractate in the Talmud. Okay. Chapter 10. So recall that Bava Metzia, we opened with people wrestling over a scarf, right? And now we come to the end. We're still arguing about who bears a loss, who's responsible, people arguing over property. But very interesting case. So all of the Mishnayos in this chapter, in this short chapter, deal with the case of people who live in a condo. So ancient condominiums, but the concept is a two-story home, a duplex, and there's problems between the residents of the upper story and the residents of the lower story. And the first mission is going to be about what happens if the building collapses, who gets to keep the stones. And then the next Mishnah is what if there's a leak in the floor of the upper story, the ceiling of the lower story, who is going to be responsible for repairing the leak? I mean, this is so, real world stuff, right? Now we can we can get it. They lived 2,000 years ago, but it's the same kind of problems that people have always been dealing with. Once we're talking about a leak in an apartment building going from an upper floor to the lower floor. Okay, page 116b, Mishnah number 1 of chapter 10. In the case of the house and the upper story belonging to two people, i.e., the lower story was owned by one individual while the upper story belonged to someone else. So the house collapsed. What do? The two of them divide the timber and the stones and the earth of the collapsed structure. Right away, this is not how modern people think. In terms of, God forbid, a house collapses. That's already so unusual. Really, we only hear of that happening when there's an earthquake, maybe some kind of terrible storm. But normally, houses don't collapse. Right? And it seems like, well, no, actually that was a little bit more common. They didn't have the same kinds of building codes, building materials that we have, thank God. And moreover, how much do we think about, well, the house collapsed, who's going to get to keep the stones so they can rebuild, right? But it was a much more resourceful type of world where people would certainly, not do away with building materials if there was any chance of reusing the building materials. They would, because people just didn't have so much stuff and they made sure to get the maximum usage out of the resources that they had. Okay, so they divide the timber and the stones and the earth of the collapsed structure. And the court, so now we're in litigation, and the court considers which stones were likely to break, those of the lower or upper story, and gives those broken stones to the one who presumably owned them, as opposed to the stones that didn't break, that are still whole, and would be, I guess, preferable to the innocent party. In other words, we're not saying it's your fault, but if you live in the lower stories and it's the stones in the walls of the lower story that broke, okay, so you get the broken stones, and the people of the upper story, they get to keep the complete stones. And if one of them recognized some of his stones, so he may take them for himself, and they count toward his amount of stones, and the other party takes the other stones accordingly, meaning the broken stones, and they do not divide the remaining stones equally. That's Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 10. Now the Gemara. From the fact that the Mishnah teaches that the court considers which stones were likely to break, so it can be understood by inference that the case is one in which it is possible to establish, with regard to the stones, by looking at the debris, how the accident occurred. Forensic, what am I looking at? For forensic analysis of the debris, right, of the broken, the collapsed house. So it is possible by looking at the debris to understand how the accident occurred, whether it fell with pressure, the word is chavasa, meaning that the lower story collapsed and the upper story followed, or whether it fell with a blow, i.e. that the upper story collapsed and caused the lower story to follow suit. So in the first instance, it is the stones of the lower story that were likely to break. In the latter instance, the stones of the upper story. Now, what's a little bit interesting to me about that is, let's just say, for example, that whoever built this house, was a century ago. I mean, these houses stood for a long time in the ancient world. And the residents who live there now, right, they bought it from the previous resident, who bought it from the previous resident, who bought it from the previous resident, right? So they didn't build it. But we're going to say that, it's not like we're assigning blame, but, right, if you're the resident of the lower story and the collapse happened because of the lower story, so then we're going to advantage the residents of the upper story a little bit because they really had nothing to do with it. And vice versa, if somehow the damage began, right, the collapse began in the upper story, so then we're going to advantage in the, as we account for and distribute the stones that are still complete and are going to be more easily rebuilt. In other words, the person's going to have to invest less in the rebuilding, right? We're going to advantage, if the collapse began in the upper story, we're going to advantage the residents of the lower story. And I think it's human nature in these kinds of situations to say, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. Now, it's neither one's fault, right? But somehow they're going to cling to this idea that, well, the problem originated in your part of the house, so you're at a bigger disadvantage than we are when it comes time to rebuild. I mean, it's just, it's human nature to go on that way. And indeed, that is how it was divided. Now, this is not so much because the Torah prescribes that you do that. It's more, I think, this is how the custom developed, and that's what they would follow. Now, the Gemara asks, if that is so, that it is possible to ascertain how the collapse occurred, then why in the first clause of the Mishnah, and you can say, by the way, if the collapse began, let's say, in the lower story, right, where the pressure caused the rocks to crumble, the residents of the upper story, I think, could legitimately say, this didn't come out of nowhere, right? So there must have been cracks developing in your walls and the stones of the lower floor, and you ignored it. Now, that's probably fair to say, and vice versa if the problem began in the upper story. Now, the Gemara asks, if that is so, that it is possible to ascertain how the collapse occurred, then why in the first clause of our Mishnah do they divide the stones without taking the circumstances into consideration? Let us see. If the house fell with a blow, it means that the stones of the upper story broke and the owner of the lower story takes the unbroken stones. And if it fell with pressure, it means that the stones of the lower story broke and the owner of the upper story takes the unbroken stones. The Gemara rejects this analysis. No, it is necessary to state the ruling of the Mishnah in a case when the house collapsed at night and no one saw how it fell. The Gemara challenges, but in such a case, let them see the stones in the morning and ascertain how the house collapsed. The Gemara answers the first clause of the Mishnah is referring to a case where they had cleared away the stones, and consequently there is no way to determine what occurred. Maybe there were people in the rubble, and of course they cleared away the stones to save the people, and then the forensic analysis of where the collapse began is impossible. So the Gemara answers the first clause of the Mishnah is referring to a case where they had cleared away the stones, and consequently there's no way to determine what occurred. And the Gemara challenges, but even in such a case, let them see who cleared the stones away, and ask that person what happened. And the Gemara explains the ruling of the first clause of the Mishnah is stated with regard to a case where the general public came and cleared away the stones and then they left, so there's no one to ask. So the Gemara challenges, but even in such a case, let them see in whose domain the stones are situated. And once this is determined, the law would be that the burden of proof rests upon the claimant, i.e. the owner of the stones situated in the other's domain. In other words, if most of the unbroken stones, right, the more valuable stones, now that we're separating the debris of the collapsed house, if the unbroken stones ended up in the domain that you could ascribe to one of the residents, like, I don't know, maybe the lower house had a courtyard next to it, right? And the upper house didn't have such a courtyard. And so most of the unbroken stones ended up in the courtyard that belongs to the residents of the lower story. So they're going to get to keep it, because if the residents of the upper story want to get those stones, they would have to prove that somehow the house, the collapse of the house originated, with the fault of the residents of the lower story. They're not going to be able to prove that. That's the case that we're talking about. We don't know exactly what caused the collapse. And since the unbroken stones are in the domain of the residents of the lower story, they're going to get to keep it, because the burden of proof would be on the one who wants to, extract those stones from the one in whose possession they are. That's the general law, that if you're trying to get damages from someone, you have the burden of proof. And if you can't meet the burden of proof, you're not going to be able to extract those damages or that property. And the Gemara answers, no. It was necessary to state the ruling of the Mishnah in a case where the stones are situated in a courtyard that belongs to both of them. So you can't say the stones are in the domain of one of them. And if you wish, say that partners in cases like this are not particular with each other about dividing the courtyard in such a way that one cannot leave his belongings on the other's side of the courtyard, and therefore the presence of the stones in the area of the courtyard belonging to one of them does not substantiate a claim for the stones, right? In other words, you can't say that it's in the domain of one of the residents, and we don't know what happened, so that's what the first part of the Mishnah was talking about, that they just divide it. Now the Mishnah teaches if one of them recognized his stones, he may take them. And the Gemara asks, and the other, what does he claim? If this one says, oh, those stones were part of my house, what does the other one say? Well, and what does he claim? If the other one says, yes, they belong to you, well, then this law is obvious. So why would the Mishnah need to state it? If one of them says, I recognize the stones, the other one says, you're right, those are your stones, there's no dispute. So what are we talking about? And if he does not say yes, right? So if the upper one says, so the lower one, let's say the residents of the lower story say, we recognize these stones. They were part of our wall, so we get the unbroken stones. And the resident of the upper story says, it must be that he says, I don't know. Because if he says no, the lower one says, these are mine. And the resident of the upper story says, no, they're not. Meaning they're ours. Well, then it's the same thing. He said versus he said, and we're right back where we were. We don't know. But here's the case that we're really talking about. If the resident of the lower story says, those stones were in my walls, the unbroken stones are our stones, and the resident of the upper story says, I don't know, right? So now you have a certain claim versus an uncertain claim. Now, we've talked about this before. So one says, I don't know, and consequently the one who stated a definitive claim is deemed credible, right? So the one who says, yes, they're mine, okay, when the other one says, I don't know, so the certain claim is going to trump the uncertain claim. And the Gemara suggests, shall we say, that it is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav Nachman. What does Rav Nachman say? We're talking about in a different situation. As it was stated that the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, disagreed about the following case. With regard to one who approaches another and says, I have 100 dinars in your possession, meaning either I lent you 100 dinars or we made a business deal and you owe me 100 dinars, but in any case, there's 100 dinars in your possession that belong to me. So I have 100 dinars in your possession, and the other one says, I don't know. Right? I am certain you owe me 100 dinars, and you say you're not sure. You don't know if you owe me 100 dinars or not. So in that situation, Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda say the respondent is liable to pay because he did not deny the claim. I say you owe me 100 dinars. You say you don't know. So you can't deny that my claim that you owe me 100 dinars. But Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yochanan say he is exempt from payment. So it appears from the Mishnah that the response, I don't know, is tantamount to an admission. Right now that we're talking about where one is sure that the stones are his and the other one doesn't know, if indeed that is the case, it seems that the one who recognizes them gets them, right? So the I don't know becomes tantamount to, okay, you're right, take the big stones. But did we really establish that from the case of one who owes 100 dinars? Let's keep reading. The Gemara refutes this contention. Just as Rav Nachman says in that context of the dinars, that he is liable to pay only in a case where there is a matter of an oath between them. Now, when do we swear an oath in cases of debt? It's where there's partial admission, right? When I say you owe me 100 dinars and you say, Sal, I paid you back 50 already, I only owe you 50. So you partially admit. I don't know is not a partial admission. But I already paid you 50, I only owe you 50 more. That is a partial admission. In that case, you can swear an oath and then you only have to pay me the 50 that you admit to because you swore an oath. Right? So there's a situation where an oath applies. And that's what Rav Nachman is saying here. Rav Nachman says in that context, he's liable to pay only in a case where there is the matter of an oath between them. So here too, it is a case where there is a matter of an oath between them. Right? In that case, Rav Nachman rules that he's liable to pay only if he is already liable to take an oath concerning his denial of part of the claim, since he does not know if he owes this sum, and he is therefore unable to take the oath then that he would be liable to take. That's why he must pay. Right? So in other words, if it's a situation where the oath would apply, the fact that he doesn't know prevents him from taking an oath. You can't take an oath if you're in a situation of uncertainty. But because it's a situation where an oath applies, he ends up having to pay. Well, in this case as well with the stones, the Mishna is discussing a case where the one who says he does not know would be liable to take an oath. Since he doesn't know, he's uncertain, he can't take that oath, and that's why the other one gets to take the unbroken stones. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of a matter of an oath? And the Gemara explains, this is in accordance with the statement of Rava. As Rava says, one who approaches another and says, I have 100 dinars in your possession. And the other one says, you have in my possession only 50 dinars that I am sure about. And as for the rest, I don't know. As one who admitted to part of a claim, he is liable by Torah law to take an oath that he does not owe the other 50 dinars. Since he cannot take an oath to that effect, as he is unsure whether he owes it or not, he must pay. Back to our Mishnah about the stones of the collapsed house. If one of them recognized some of his stones, he may take them for himself. And they count toward his amount of stones. And the other party takes the other stones accordingly, meaning the broken stones. Rava thought to say that this means they count toward his amount of his broken stones. In other words, the first party takes the unbroken stones that he recognized in place of a similar amount of broken stones, and the other party takes an amount of broken stones corresponding to the amount of the unbroken stones claimed by the first person. So apparently, since he said, I don't know, his legal status is worse. Abaye said to him, on the contrary, this one, the one who recognizes some of his stones, is worse off. He is worse off because since he knows and recognizes these stones, now we're talking about broken stones, he evidently does not know anything about any more stones. And therefore he has no rights to any more unbroken stones, and all the others are the property of the other party. So rather, Abaye said that it means they count toward his amount of his unbroken stones. In other words, the first party takes the unbroken stones that he recognized in place of a similar amount of unbroken stones, and the other party takes an amount of unbroken stones corresponding to the amount of unbroken stones claimed by the first person. And the Gemara asks, if so, what did the first party gain from recognizing his own stones? And the Gemara answers, he gains with regard to bricks from the structure made in a wide brick mold. If his bricks were constructed from a wider mold, he is entitled to these slightly larger ones. Alternatively, if the clay from which his bricks were formed was processed better, he gains by obtaining superior bricks. Right, and now it's funny, we've been talking about stones. I think we have an image in our mind of, actual rocks, but this would also apply to bricks. And the note here explains, what are we talking about? Bricks? So you had a rectangular box, and you would put mud and straw into it, right? And then take it out, a nice well-formed brick, let it dry in the sun or in an oven. And it was a brick house that we're talking about. And possibly the lower story was made of higher quality bricks, and he recognizes those bricks. And the upper story was made of a different kind of brick. And then it would, of course, be much easier to separate, who owns what, if the building materials of the one story were visibly different than the building materials of the other. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 10. Mishnah number 2. If there was a house and an upper story owned by one person, so the house and the upper story are owned by one person, and meaning the lower story and the upper story are owned by one person, and the upper story was rented out to another. Right? So the guy owns a duplex, he lives in the lower story, and he rents out the upper story to another person. So if the floor of the upper story was broken, i.e. it fell in or collapsed, and the owner of the house does not want to repair it, okay? So cheap landlord doesn't want to fix the floor of the upper story. A little hard to imagine. You're living on the lower floor. There's people walking around upstairs that are your tenants, and there's a hole in the ceiling. You can look up and they can look down. You would think the landlord would want to fix that floor, but maybe he can't afford it. So the floor of the upper story was broken, i.e. it fell in or collapsed, and the owner of the house does not want to repair it. So in that situation, the resident of the upper story can go down and live in the lower house until the owner repairs the upper story for him. Strong incentive for the landlord to get busy and fix the floor, which is his ceiling, but to fix the floor of the upper story. Rabbi Yosef says, with regard to a house of 2 stories owned by 2 people, and now we're the condo, lower floor owned by one person, upper floor owned by another. And in that building, the ceiling collapsed. The in-between floor collapsed. So the owner of the lower story provides the ceiling of beams or stones, and the owner of the upper story provides the plaster. Right? So the structural elements are provided by the owner of the lower floor, and the finishing elements, the plaster, are provided by the owner of the upper floor. That's Mishnah number 2. Now the Gemara. And the Gemara asks, in the case of the floor of an upper story that was broken, to what extent did it break? what is the extent of damage that permits the upper resident to say that he is no longer able to live there and he's going to have to live downstairs with his landlord? So Rav says if most of it was damaged. And Shmuel says a break of 4 handbreadths occurred. Right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So if you have a hole about this big in the floor of the upper story, something like that, then that's enough that the resident of the upper story can say, yeah, I can't live here. Not with a hole that big in my floor. If you won't fix it, I'm going to move in downstairs with you. The Gemara analyzes their opinions. Rav says he can only move downstairs if most of the floor was damaged. But if the break is only 4 handbreadths, then this law does not apply, since the owner of the upper story can cause the lower story to place the item that would normally be placed in the area of the hole. And a person can reside partially on a level below and partially on a level above. It's a little bit, the language is a little confusing, but what he's saying is, okay, according to Rav, if there's damage in the floor, but it's not that most of the floor has a problem, then whatever heavy object would have been stored in the upper story at that location where now the floor is bad, he can say to the landlord, right, who lives downstairs, I'm going to store that furniture in your house, okay? And whenever I need it, I'm going to come into your house and use it. Still, very strong incentive for the landlord to fix the floor. But he doesn't fully move in downstairs. He's just going to put his furniture down there that would have stood where the problem with the floor is. Now, the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of the case in the Mishnah? If the owner said at the time of the rental that he is renting this upper story to the tenant, so the tenant has rights only to this upper story, and he has now lost the ability to live there. So rather, the owner said to him that he wants to rent an upper story to him without specifying which one. So if so, the renter is certainly entitled to functional living quarters, and the owner must rent him an upper story in a different house belonging to this owner where he can live. It's very interesting. It's as if, right, we talked about this language like when you're consecrating a sheep, right? Did you consecrate as a pledge to bring an offering to the temple this sheep or a sheep, right? So if you consecrated this sheep and this sheep develops a blemish, okay, so it can't be brought as an offering, it's left to graze, whatever the issue is going to be, but that's what happened. If you consecrate a sheep as an offering and this sheep develops a blemish, so it can't be brought as an offering, but you have to replace it with another sheep that is going to be brought as an offering. So likewise here, if you say, I'm renting to you an upper story, well then when this one becomes uninhabitable, you have to find another upper story for that tenant to live in. But if you rented him this one, then, if there's problems with it, we're going to have to deal with that, but you don't have to find him an alternate living quarter. The Gemara answers that Rava says that's not what's going on here. No, it is necessary to state the ruling of the Mishnah in a case where the owner said to him, this upper story that I'm renting to you, when it is up, meaning when it is functional, so live up there in it. And when it descends, i.e. when it is no longer functional, well then descend with it and live in the lower story. I'm renting you the upper story, and if something happens to it, then you can come down and live in the lower story with us. And the Gemara asks, if so, what is the purpose of the Mishnah stating this ruling, as there was an explicit condition to this effect? And the Gemara answers, rather, Rav Ashi said, this is a case where the owner said to him, I'm renting to you this particular upper story, which is on top of this particular house. And by emphasizing that the upper story is above that particular house, the owner thereby rendered the house as liened with regard to the upper story. Although he did not explicitly state that the renter will have the right to live in the lower house if the upper story becomes non-functional, that is the effect of saying to him, you are hereby renting this upper story of this house. And the Gemara adds, and this is in accordance with that which Rav and Bar Rav Ada said, that Rabbi Yitzchak said. There was an incident involving one who said to another, I am selling you the vine that is on top of this peach tree. And then the peach tree was uprooted. And the incident came before Rabbi Chia, and he said, you are obligated to erect for him a peach tree to support the vine as long as the vine exists. You sold him a vine on top of a peach tree. So it's your peach tree, but now that the peach tree has been uprooted, you have to replace or fix the peach tree so that his vine can continue to grow on top of a peach tree, because that's what you sold to him. If the peach tree gets chopped down and there is no peach tree, then he doesn't have to repair or get it back up there. But as long as it's possible to do so, he's obligated to get that peach tree standing so the vine can keep growing on it. Rabbi Abba Bar Memel raised a dilemma with regard to a resident of the upper story who is entitled to move into the lower story. When he resides there, does he reside alone, as he did at the outset when he occupied the upper story, and the owner of the house has no choice but to move out? Or perhaps they both reside there together, as the owner can say to him, I did not rent the upper story to you with the intention of being removed from my own domicile. Right? Does the landlord have to move out of his own house because there was a problem with the floor of the upper story? It's bad enough that the tenant of the upper story now can move in with him, with the landlord, but does the landlord actually have to move out? Now we are on page 117a, getting a head start on tomorrow's daf. So if you say that they both reside in the lower story together, when the upper story resident uses the house, does he use it by way of its entrances, like the owner? Or must he use it by way of the roofs? Must he climb the stairs and enter the upper story and then descend to the lower story by way of a ladder from there? Can the owner say, the tenant must act as he did at the outset, and just as at the outset he entered by way of the roofs, now too he must enter by way of the roofs? Or perhaps the renter can say to him, I accepted upon myself an ascent and agreed to climb the stairs to the upper story, but I did not accept upon myself an ascent and a descent, which would be necessary if I entered by way of the roofs. Now that's, again, like we think in our modern world, well, what are you talking about? Like when you walk into a building, there might be a front entrance and a rear entrance, but the entrances are on the ground floor. But very much, if you walk around in the old city of Jerusalem, you could see this right away, that there are lower houses, that have their doors at the street level, and there are upper residences that you access by, the upper, sort of the upper realm, right? That you can walk across rooftops and enter those houses, and the upper story and the lower story don't communicate with each other, right? You could be renting out a house that's on top of your house, but they do not have any kind of common entrance. The upper story is accessed by a completely different path along the rooftops, whereas the lower story is accessed by a street, at the lower level. And now that, the floor collapsed and the resident of the upper story is going to be living with you in the lower story, you see why there's this question, can he use your entrances? In other words, does he have full access to the whole lower house with you? Or are you simply providing him a space within the lower house that's accessed by the upper house, and you're not giving him full reign of the lower house? And if you say that the tenant can say to the owner, I did not accept upon myself an ascent and a descent, in a case where there were two upper stories, where there's two upper stories, this one on top of that one, 3-story house, then what is the law? And the Gemara clarifies the circumstances of this question. If the floor of the higher upper story was broken, clearly he may descend and reside in the lower one. But if the floor of the lower upper story, right, the middle story, was broken, then what is the law? Is he required to ascend the full way and reside in the higher upper story, or does he go down and reside on the ground floor? And do we say that the owner of the house can say to the tenant, you accepted upon yourself the term an upper story, and I provided you with one? Or perhaps one says that the tenant accepted upon himself one ascent, but he did not accept upon himself 2 ascents. And no answer was found for these questions, and the Gemara concludes these dilemmas shall stand unresolved. Take coup. Now, because these dilemmas were not resolved, right, you have a situation where if they actually do come up, then it's almost like, well, whichever tenant acts first is going to establish, possession of the situation, possession of the property. And the other one who is seeking to remove him will have the burden of proof, but the law won't be on his side because the law wasn't established. So that's a case where you want to, consult your lawyer first and take action accordingly. New subject. The Mishnah teaches, Rabbi Yosei says, the lower resident provides the ceiling and the upper resident provides the plaster, right? When the floor breaks between, now we're talking about condo, right? So the upper residence is owned by one person, the lower residence is owned by a different person, but they're both owners. And now there's a problem in the floor, so the lower one provides what am I telling about? The structural elements, and the upper one provides the finish elements, the plaster. Okay. So, Rabbi Yosei says, the lower resident provides the ceiling and the upper resident provides the plaster. And the Gemara asks, what is the word ceiling referring to in this context? So Rabbi Yosei Bar Chanina says, mats and beams. And the sage Satini says that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, wide wooden planks. And the Gemara comments, and these two opinions do not disagree over the basic law. Rather, this sage rules in accordance with the custom of his locale, and that sage rules in accordance with the custom of his locale. And they were describing the necessary materials for a ceiling according to the local building codes. And the Gemara relates, an incident occurred with these two people who were residing in the same house, one in the upper story and the other one in the lower story. And the plaster of the floor of the upper story broke, so that when the resident of the upper apartment would wash with water, it would run down and cause damage to the lower story. A very comprehensible dilemma. Water is leaking from the upper story into the lower story. And the question was, who must repair the ceiling? So Rabbi Chia bar Abba says the upper resident repairs it. And Rabbi Eli says in the name of Rabbi Chia, the son of Rabbi Yosei, the lower resident repairs it. And the Gemara comments, and the following verse can serve as a mnemonic device to help remember who issued the ruling. Right? So remember, it was Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, when there's a leak in the floor to the lower level, the upper resident has to repair it. And Rabbi Eli says, in the name of Rabbi Chia, the son of Rabbi Yosei, that the lower resident pays for it. And to help us remember that, we have the verse Genesis 39:1, and Yosef was brought down to Egypt, right? Joseph, but Yosef was brought down to Egypt, and Yosef sounds like Yosei. It's not the same name, but it sounds similar. And that helps us remember, how much it helps us, you could ask, but that Rabbi Eli says in the name of Rabbi Chia, who says in the name of Rabbi Yosei, that the lower one is responsible for the damage, just like Yosef was brought down into Egypt. Sounds like Yosei, who says that it's the lower resident who pays. The Gemara suggests, shall we say that Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Eli disagree with regard to the matter that was a subject to a dispute between Rabbi Yosei and the rabbis? Right? Now we're not citing Rabbi Yosei as the father of a sage whose teaching was brought down in the name of another sage. Rather, now we're actually talking about Rabbi Yosei's own ruling in a different context. And where Rabbi Yosei disagreed with the rabbis, right? So Rabbi Yosei versus the rabbis. Now usually the lone voice versus the majority ruled, and we follow the majority. But with Rabbi Yosei, let's see, because Rabbi Yosei is almost always right. Let's see. So in the dispute between Rabbi Yosei and the rabbis in the Mishnah, the explanation of the dispute would then be as follows. According to the one who says that the upper resident repairs it, he holds that the responsibility is on the one potentially responsible for the damage to distance himself from the one whose property is potentially damaged. And this accounts for the opinion of Rabbi Yosei in the Mishnah, who holds that the resident of the upper story must provide the plaster because his water is clearly causing the damage below, right? So it's not that you're talking about, we're worried about rot in the ceiling over time that it's going to collapse. What we're talking about right now is the water of the upper resident is dripping into the lower guy's house, right? It's very annoying, problematic issue for the person in the lower house to have water dripping, from his ceiling into his house. Whose water is it? The guy in the upper story. So who should replace the plaster and make sure that water doesn't leak down into the lower floor? The guy in the upper story. And the one who says that the lower resident repairs it, he holds like the rabbis in their dispute with Rabbi Yosef, who say that the responsibility is on the one whose property is potentially damaged to distance himself from the one potentially responsible for the damage. In other words, the rabbis say, okay, yeah, sounds like morally correct. Like it sounds good that the guy up there, it's his water coming down, so therefore, sue him and get him to pay. Okay, but that could take a while. And in the meantime, you're getting dripped on. So as a matter of common sense, the one on the lower floor should just get it fixed because he's going to be the one much more motivated to get it done. So, you don't want to have water dripping on you, so fix it. And the Gemara asks, and how can you understand it that way? Do Rabbi Yosef and the rabbis disagree in the Mishna with regard to distancing oneself from damages? But haven't we heard them say the opposite? As we learned in a Mishnah tractate, Bava Basra, our next tractate, one must distance a tree 25 cubits from a pit because its roots damage the pit. And in the case of a carob or a sycamore tree whose roots spread far, one must distance the tree from the pit by a distance of 50 cubits. And this is the law, whether the pit or the tree is located above or to the side of the other. Now, so the general rule is a pit and a tree have to be far apart because the roots of the tree will damage the pit. The question becomes, who's responsible, right? In other words, they have to be far apart, but who's going to have to deal with it? Is it the one who owns the pit that's going to have to relocate his pit? Or is it the one who owns the tree who's going to have to chop down his tree and either, reroot it somewhere else or plant another tree? Who's going to be responsible? So the question depends on if the pit preceded the tree, meaning the guy who planted the tree near the pit, too close, he has to move the tree. So if the pit preceded the tree, the owner of the pit may cut down the tree and pay its monetary value, but he has the right to cut it down. If the tree preceded the pit, then he may not cut it down. If it is uncertain whether this tree preceded that pit, and it is uncertain whether that pit preceded this tree, then he may not cut down the tree. Because we know that they need to be apart, but the owner of the pit doesn't have the right to cut down the tree. They're going to have to figure it out. Rabbi Yosef says, even if the pit preceded the tree, he may not cut down the tree. Why? As this one digs in his own property and that one plants in his own property. I mean, the guy who planted the tree planted it on his property. So even if the pit was already there, he could say, well, okay, you put a pit near the edge of the border, the property line, right, between your yard and mine, okay, but you shouldn't have put your pit there. Because the bottom line is, it's my property. I can put a tree wherever I want on my property. Consequently, the owner of the pit cannot complain about the damage. And if he wants to avoid it, he can dig his pit elsewhere. I actually had a situation like this right here in our yard. We had bamboo. We don't have it anymore, but at one time we had bamboo. Bamboo, very invasive roots. And we knew that it would be invasive, so we put a very good barrier, concrete barrier, on the property line so that the bamboo roots wouldn't go into the neighbor's yard. Well, then what happened was that that neighbor moved away. The new owner of that property tore down the house, replaced it with a modern, kind of cheaply made, huge house, McMansion style. And what he did was he elevated the backyard in order to accommodate his plans. Now, when he elevated the backyard, what he did is he put earth adjoining our bamboo above that rhizome barrier that we had created. So now the bamboo escaped, the roots escaped, and went and invaded the neighbor's property. And now that new owner, who wasn't there, not when the bamboo was planted and not when that, replacement house was put there with the new design. And, and what they did is when they put that earth level higher up, they didn't put any kind of barrier there, just like an old wood fence. I mean, it was such bad building. But now my roots were indeed growing into the neighbor's yard, and he was mad, right? So what do? It really wasn't my fault. We had taken precautions. That builder was unscrupulous, did it the wrong way, then sold it. And now this guy who bought it didn't realize he was buying a problem, had a problem. But the bottom line was it was my roots going into his yard. So I could have told him, well, if you don't like it, pay for the barrier. But we said, let's be good neighbors. We'll just remove the bamboo. At this point, we don't mind so much. We want to do something different in the backyard. But you can see how these are very, very real world problems that we are talking about. Right, so consequently, the owner of the pit cannot claim about the damage if the guy planted a tree in his own yard. So apparently the Mishnah indicates that Rabbi Yosei holds that the responsibility is on the one whose property is potentially receiving the damage to distance himself from the one potentially responsible for the damage. In other words, Rabbi Yosei would have said to my neighbor, hey, whether you think it's Sal's fault or not, if you want to make sure that your property isn't damaged, you deal with it. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yosei hold that the responsibility is on the one potentially responsible for the damage to distance himself from the one whose property is potentially damaged, right? So they would have said that I should do what I did. Okay, it is your roots, so deal with it so that they don't harm your neighbors, since they are, in fact, your roots. Rather, if it can be said that the Amoraim disagree with regard to the issue that is the subject of the dispute between these Tanaim, then they disagree in the dispute between Rabbi Yosei and the rabbis there concerning the question of who is obligated to distance himself from the damage, but it has nothing to do with the dispute in our Mishnah here of the water leaking from the upper story to the lower story. So the Gemara asks, and with regard to what principle do Rabbi Yosei and the rabbis of the Mishnah here disagree? So the Gemara answers, they disagree with regard to the strength of a ceiling. The rabbis hold that the function of the plaster is to strengthen the ceiling, not so much to seal it as to strengthen it to protect it from collapsing. And strengthening the ceiling is the obligation of the lower resident, as he is required to strengthen it. You can see why, so it doesn't collapse on him and his family. And Rabbi Yosei holds that the function of the plaster is to level out any holes so that the surface of the ceiling will be flat, and leveling out holes is the obligation of the upper resident, as he is required to level them out because that's to his benefit to have a nice flat floor for him to walk around on. Now the Gemara, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara challenges the above conclusion. Is that so? But didn't Rav Ashi say, when I was in the school of Rav Kahana, we would say that Rabbi Yosei concedes in the case of his arrows. Why are we talking about arrows? Because when you shoot an arrow, right, it could land somewhere else, but you shot it, you're responsible for where the arrow lands. If it's your water leaking through the ceiling, it's like your arrows. If it's your roots going into your neighbor's yard, it's like your arrows. That's what's being said. So didn't Rav Ashi say, when I was in the school of Rav Kahana, we would say that Rabbi Yosei concedes in a case of his arrows. Although Rabbi Yosei holds that the responsibility is on the one whose property is potentially damaged to distance himself from the one potentially responsible for the damage, that is only if the one causing the damage is not performing a direct action that is causing the damage, as in the case of the tree and the pit. But if he is performing an action that causes damage from a distance, as in this case, it's his water leaking through the floor, then he is like someone shooting arrows who is certainly obligated to ensure that he does not cause any damage. If it's his water leaking through the floor, he better fix his floor, put in the plaster, do what he needs to do so that the water doesn't get to the lower resident. And the Gemara answers, this is a case in which the water flow stops in one place. as the hole in the floor is not directly in the place where the water was poured, and subsequently it falls into the lower story once it flows to the opening in the floor, and consequently, even in this case, the upper resident does not directly cause the damage. I'm having trouble understanding. That's a little attenuated. What they're saying is, well, it's not that the water leaks straight through. It's that the water kind of flowed to one side, and then it went into the floor, and then over time, it kind of eased its way back and leaked into the lower story from another location in the ceiling. Yeah, okay, but where did that water come from? It came from the upper story. So I don't quite understand why the circuitous path of the water drip makes it less the arrows of the upper story. But I guess you can argue, this is a floor, right? Floor of the upper, ceiling of the lower, that needs strengthening. What I guess you could say is that over time, it's not that it's dripping on the lower guy, but it is weakening that ceiling. And probably the best thing would be for these two people to just split and make sure that is structurally and in a manner of being sealed sound, in both ways, and they should split the costs. But if one is unwilling, that's when we're going to revert, have recourse to these laws to figure it out. And that concludes our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 10 of Tractate Bava Metzia. With God's help, we'll pick it up again tomorrow, Wednesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, with Mishnah number 3. Looks like I have 2 questions. Joe, can a trellis be built in lieu of replacing the peach tree, right? When you sell a vine on top of a peach tree. That's a great question. What are you really promising to provide, right? Is it that the vine needs to be up there so that it can get to the sun, and a trellis supports it just as well? Or is there some symbiotic relationship between the vine and the peach tree such that putting a trellis in place of the peach tree would be insufficient? I don't know. Good question. Joseph, what if nobody is liable? It just happens in one's property, but no negligence has been found. Why would someone need to be at fault? Is it just to settle the dispute of ownership? See, I think that is exactly what we're talking about, right? It's not, I don't think it's settling a dispute of ownership. I think we're just settling, well, it's nobody's fault, but the one who we would think, somehow our instinct is telling us he should pay, he doesn't want to pay. He doesn't want to pay. Now, if he doesn't want to pay, let's say he's the upper story, the fact is his life is not really being affected, and if we don't have a legal principle that we can rely on, then the one in the lower story is going to be out of luck, and he's just going to have to end up fixing it because it's in his interest to fix it. If he doesn't fix it, ultimately, he's the one that's going to suffer from it. And if he doesn't have a law that he can rely on to extract money from the guy in the upper story, then he's got no choice. Either he fixes it or he keeps getting dripped on. But if we can establish, that negligence is there, or that we have a presumption of liability, if we can compare it to arrows being shot, or if we can compare it, to one of these other cases where there would be reason to extract money from the upper story, then we could either get him to fix it or we could get them to split it. And that's why, it's nuanced and we have to be so careful, and why the sages are, it's funny, like we get to the last chapter where we get to the most practical laws, right? I mean, this is just stuff that comes up all the time. And that is so often the case. That's what I've got for us today. Looking forward to learning with you tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a